Everything about the film was groundbreaking.
Jiminy crickets.
The characters had to assume real personality in a way that they'd never had to do before.
What's the matter? Can't cut your tongue?
Both vocally and visually, they had to live on the screen and make us care about them.
And please make Grumpy like me.
When Walt started Snow White, he had his core of animators who had animated the shorts. So there were a handful of superior animators. But Walt quickly realized he was going to need a whole core of new animators if he was going to get this through.
10 people were working in that studio in 1928 when Steamboat Willie was premiered. By the time Snow White was happening, people were saying, we've got to have another 300 artists.
It was a kind of, a call to Mecca. Come to Mecca. We're doing great things here, and we need you. And that period attracted, some of the most famous animators in the history of the Walt Disney Studio, all of whom came to work on Snow White in various capacities. So you had this tremendous infusion of talent that was just aching to do something, and also learning how to do it on Snow White.
Well, the time was 1935. The Depression was on right down to the rock bottom. So a lot of us were out of school around this period of time. And the only person who was advertising for artists was Walt Disney.
You have to realize that what things were like in the Depression times. People were starving to death. And so it was a boon to be able to find a place where they would hire you and ask you to do your very best work, the very best that you could, and actually train you at the same time. And he was trying to teach us to be good enough artists to do what he wanted to do.
Well, I went there because there was a depression on at the time, which influenced the growth of the studio more than probably any other single factor.
You can say the times gave him more talent, but to me, the difference between Walt and some of the other cartoon producers was that Walt felt it so strongly inside. He wanted to do nothing but the very best that he knew he could inspire out of a great group of artists.
There was a tremendous pride in the place because of the fact that Walt was always trying to lift you up higher with all the classes and the films. He was always asking you to observe and study things, and there was constantly an effort to raise your standards, and you couldn't turn us off. We were excited about it.
But at the same time, we didn't think the studio would last more than another week. It was exciting and it was fun. Sure had a great collection of artists and stimulating people around you. But you couldn't believe that anything like Snow White would go over with an audience.
Hello? May I come in?
The stretch run of Snow White is really, really interesting because it is a stretch run. I mean, they're galloping full speed. Walt had not finally settled on even the names of the dwarves until less than a year before the release of the movie. So they're working full throttle trying to get this thing out in time for its December 21st release. They're worried that they're not going to do it. They're worried about what's going to happen if they don't do it.
A fine kettle of fish.
It's an incredible amount of work. I mean, most animated features on the average take about 4 years to make the movie, but at least nowadays we know that the rewards can be great. I think when they did Snow White, they really didn't know what the end result would be. The downside could have been the end of the studio. So while the future looked potentially bright, it also could be potentially tragic.
Don't worry. I'll be all right.
And indeed, the film gets completed literally, 2.5 weeks before its premiere. They didn't even have time to fully advertise the movie.
In fact, because we had no money to advertise the picture, we got these little placards about 1.5 feet high, and it was our job to go through Hollywood. All of us in the studio went out and tapped these on the telephone poles. It was the only way they knew about it. But of course, the premiere was sold out.
The premiere evening was very exciting. First Hollywood premiere I'd ever attended. It was at the wonderful old Carthay Circle Theater. We walked down this long double drive, and here were all the big searchlights and everything.
The part of the premiere that I remember the best was the end, after we got through it. The beginning, I was so nervous and uptight that I think I was nearly sick to my stomach, and I think most of us were.
It was, of course, the biggest event in my life, and there were cameramen lined up the whole distance. I was amazed. And the thing that amazed me were the number of Hollywood stars there. I can remember sitting close to Lombard and Clark Gable and so forth, but at the climax of the film, everybody started crying. I couldn't believe it. Here was a cartoon, plain old crude cartoon, as the critics had said before we made it, and here was the audience crying en masse.
I remember that they laughed at the right places. They took it all just the way Walt wanted them to. Just was beautifully received.
They stood and they clapped and they clapped and they clapped. I tell you, I've never had goosebumps like that.
It was a great event. It was a big event in all of our lives.
Here were all these names on the screen and all these people, and they were great talents. And I mean really great talents. But, oh, I'm sure of this, you could take all of us. Every one of the guys' names are on that screen, and everybody else had to do with the studio. And if there had never been a Walt Disney, all of these people worked in the same place. There never would have been a Snow White.
I think Walt's genius was he was so ordinary in the sense that he knew what most people felt. He was the best audience himself. If he felt it, you could bet other people would feel it. But he was so uncommon in his reach for the dream that he had. And here's a guy that perhaps is one of the few people in this world that have been able through their lifetime to realize a continuous unfolding of their dreams.
Someday my prince will come.
The respect I have for that movie 70 years later is amazing, because I think that they put more work and effort into that film than many films that are made today, where it's become too easy to do the things that they couldn't do, but had to find out a way to do it. So the film is important for many reasons, but as an adventure in filmmaking, I think it ranks up there amongst the best of them.
I don't know if a lot of people know this, it was such a big hit that it actually inspired MGM to give the go-ahead to The Wizard of Oz as a family film to try and compete with the success of Snow White.
I certainly feel The Wizard of Oz borrowed from Snow White, and Star Wars borrowed from The Wizard of Oz, and they've built on the foundation these fantasy films that create a believable universe. The fantasy films that have worked have followed that same template that Walt did, where you create an imaginary world, but you make it believable. That kind of expressionistic filmmaking that Walt Disney and his fellow artists were doing really seeped out into the rest of the filmmaking world.
The way that Snow White inspired people, creative people in so many senses, it's incalculable how that film changed cinema, changed animation. If Snow White hadn't existed, we'd probably all be in a different place right now.